About a year ago, millions of people descended on Washington, D.C. to see the inauguration of Barack Obama. It was obviously a historic event. Here you had the first African-American president elected, set to move into a White House that was built by slaves. And something like 2 million people crowded into the area right around where the inauguration took place. And the mood in the country was euphoric, because we were, of course, at the time in the middle of the greatest economic financial meltdown since the great crash of 1929. Unemployment was set to rise. There was panic within the capitalist class, but among working people, there was a great deal of hope and high expectations in Barack Obama. In his campaign, he made frequent allusions to the great struggles of the past, the civil rights movement, the women's struggle, the right to vote, to labor unions who carried out sit-in strikes, which were an illegal seizure of corporate property back in the 1930s. Again and again, he made these references. And his movement, well, as he called it, incorporated large numbers of young people who were fed up with the George W. Bush years of endless war, tax giveaways to the wealthy, and general transfer of wealth from working people to the rich, and the continuing attacks on living standards. Real wages actually declined in the decade preceding the election for the first time during an economic expansion in the history of the U.S. So there was tremendous hope and expectations with Obama. A year later, the picture is very different. After the recent election of a Republican in Massachusetts, the state where Ted Kennedy, the liberal figure, had been in office for nearly 50 years, there's panic among the Democratic Party. Their health care program, which has been already compromised and corrupted by deals cut with the big pharmaceutical companies and with big health insurance lobbies, is now in doubt. Very little has been done to tackle the problem of unemployment. Officially, unemployment is at 10%, but a broader measure of unemployment, which includes people working involuntarily part-time, people who have dropped out of the labor force, is something like 17%, which is not so far away from the worst figures of the Great Depression in the 1930s of around 25%. And of course, in some centers of the country, it is actually a full-blown depression. Obviously, the auto industry center in Detroit is a case in point, but in basically the old industrial areas of the United States have been particularly hard hit. Something like 10 million manufacturing jobs have been lost over the last decade. So there's the social crisis has intensified as a result of this long-term unemployment. And Obama's main priorities since coming into office have been mainly to prop up the financial sector, to prop up the banks. The U.S. government has either loaned, invested, or guaranteed $13 trillion to banks and financial institutions and other companies, which is nearly equivalent to the entire annual economic output of the United States. Now, they're not going to pay $13 trillion, but the government is essentially standing behind transactions involving some of the largest companies. And effectively, they've handed over the U.S. economy to financial institutions in order to prop them up. By contrast, to take one example, people who are behind on their mortgage payments or whose homes are no longer worth what they paid for them, when they've gone to the government to try and get relief, only something like 16,000 have received any kind of help. And that's only a temporary help for 5 years. The actual principal value of their homes doesn't get reduced under those plans. And with foreclosures set to rise above 4 million this year and perhaps another couple of million beyond that, the result is an evisceration of whatever wealth that working people have had in terms of their homes. There's a mythology in the United States that ordinary working people own lots of stocks and so forth. Well, if they do, it's because through their pension plans or through various retirement plans, but primarily their wealth is actually in their homes, the value of which have now been driven downward enormously. The economic crisis has also led to extreme amounts of The economic crisis has also led to extreme budget cuts at the state and local level across the U.S. and the result of which is something like 40,000 teachers have lost their jobs just over the last year. As a result, class sizes are increasing, the pressure on teachers is increased, and so forth. In California, for example, state workers, public employees, have been asked to take so-called furlough days, unpaid days off, which amount to something like 14% pay cut. And that's become the benchmark figure for similar sorts of plans, both in the private industry and in the public sector. In short, what we're seeing is a strategy on the part of the U.S. capitalist class to reduce permanently the standard of living for workers in the U.S. In previous recessions, corporate America has seized the opportunity to lower labor costs in the U.S. to better compete with Europe and Japan. Now, obviously, the rising economic power is China, and capital is determined to push workers' living standards as far down as possible in order to maintain certain strategic industrial sectors against the new competition from China and other rivals. So one might ask, what are the political consequences of this, given the high expectations and hopes? There's a great deal of disillusionment and I would say bewilderment on the part of the people who elected Obama. For quite some time, for quite a number of months, people were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and wait for change. Obama, at his key acceptance speech for the Democratic Party nomination back in August of 2008, said, the problem with the Bush years is that you're on your own. That's the solution for other Republicans for everything. All the costs are to be borne by individuals. What's different for us is that help is on the way. And people were prepared for some months to accept that. Help hasn't been on the way, and as a result, people are confused politically and casting about for some kind of answer, and the Republicans in the right wing are attempting to fill the gap by posturing as populists. The irony is that you can hear Republican members of Congress get up and denounce the bank bailouts and denounce the government for being too close to Wall Street, when of course they're the main political party traditionally of big capital in the United States. But because the Democrats have assumed that role, the Republicans can offer a message which isn't particularly coherent, but nevertheless seems to tap into the popular anger, and they've been able to mobilize sections of the middle class around this program. So really the problem we're facing in the United States is whether the left can actually put forward some kind of alternative and actually rally the forces of the social movements, left-wing activists, and including people who had supported Obama. The difficulty is that we're facing the long-term decline of the left of over some 30 years in the past, so that the main organizations we might look to try and resist the attacks and begin to fight back, such as the labor unions, are in very poor shape to do so. They're either incapable because of their objective weakness, or they're unwilling to lead the struggles because they put having a close relationship with the White House and the Democrats in Congress ahead of any kind of struggle that might risk those relationships. And there are struggles, of course. They break out here and there, and one of the more exciting struggles has been the new movement of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people who have, based on a referendum that overturned the gay marriage law in California, forged new organizations, new activist networks across the U.S., outside the traditional gay rights organizations, most of which are quite incorporated into the Democratic Party. And this network, with very little professional apparatus, was able to organize a demonstration a few months back of some 200,000 people. They didn't have a lot of resources to do that. People managed to get themselves there. And that, I think, showed some of the capacity and energy that's there, and showed that expectations are raised and that people do want to fight for a different set of priorities than they're getting from the government. The anti-war movement in the U.S. Came in very strongly with a massive demonstration of 1 million or more in New York City on February 15th, part of the global mobilization on that date against the war. It was a very broad mobilization, but politically rather shallow, and was once the war was unleashed, the movement found it difficult to try to rally those forces again. There were several significant mobilizations, national demonstrations. There's a quite important emergence of organization among veterans of the Iraq and Afghan wars. But the anti-war movement has been limited by its lack of political horizons. And what I mean by that is that the main liberal forces who came to the anti-war work did so only during the mobilization against of U.S. forces against Iraq. They had failed to do so during the Afghan war. That was marketed as the good war, even though people didn't like the excesses of Bush and his cowboy approach to diplomacy. The liberal groups who had traditionally made up part of the anti-war forces were unwilling to challenge even Bush in terms of the Afghan war. Around Iraq, the picture turned, and there was an expectation that we could stop. This was a war that could be stopped and should be stopped, and the mobilization showed there was some capacity to mount a serious campaign. However, even as early as the 2004 presidential campaign of John Kerry, the main leadership of the anti-war movement put its energy towards getting John Kerry elected. The irony, of course, was that, or tragedy, perhaps it's better to say, was that John Kerry was for, as he put it, winning the war. That his argument was that he would prosecute the Iraq war better than Bush. And you had a situation in which the anti-war movement was essentially throwing its weight behind a candidate who was not anti-war. And so from after, I don't believe the anti-war movement ever recovered from the 2004 election. And as Obama campaigned for office, the remaining forces of the anti-war movement put their energy into the Obama campaign because Obama actually had opposed the Iraq war from the outset. And many people heard what they wanted to hear, in that he was a president who was willing to say that the U.S. had made a mistake and should pull back. This sounds very different from the rhetoric that they were getting from Bush. But at the same time, Obama also made it clear that he saw Afghanistan as a much more important war, and he vowed to escalate it. Now, of course, he has done so with a 30,000 troop, $30 billion buildup, which has been taking place over the last several months. And this war promises to be a long and open-ended one, because like Iraq, the U.S. really has no exit plan in Afghanistan. The aim in both countries is to create a client state with a permanent U.S. military presence along the lines of South Korea. Whether they can do that is another question, based on the resistance that they're going to face in Afghanistan and now Pakistan, of course. And in Iraq, while relatively stable compared to what it was a few years ago, is by no means the kind of setup that U.S. imperialism would like to have. So essentially we have a continued buildup of U.S. forces, beyond even, under Obama's budget, beyond even what Bush had proposed. And Obama has shown himself to be just as committed to the maintenance of U.S. imperialism and its extension as the Bush administration before it. In fact, the Bush administration had neglected Latin America, which was a good thing for the left. The Obama administration seems determined to turn back the tide, the so-called pink tide in Latin America. And the obvious evidence of that is not only propping up a stolen election in Mexico and propping up Uribe's attempted third term in Colombia, but backing the coup in Honduras as a message that the U.S. is going to be firmly pushing for a right-wing comeback across Latin America. And in that context, the miserable amount of money that the U.S. has promised for the victims of the Haitian earthquake begins to make more sense. Essentially what the U.S. has done in the aftermath of the quake is actually expand the occupation, which had been carried largely by Brazil the last few years, and make sure that no Haitians can escape. There's actually an encirclement of the island, or of the country, I should say, by U.S. military ships in order to force desperate people trying to flee the country back into the miserable conditions that they find themselves in.